Please pretend you know me, Charlotte whispered, sliding into the seat across from Mason before he could answer. Mason, a single father nursing coffee after a long shift, felt her hand tremble against the table. Three men in dark suits pushed through the front door, eyes sweeping the room like they were hunting someone. Charlotte reached across and laced her fingers through his, smiling like a woman greeting a familiar lover. Mason had no idea she ran a company worth hundreds of millions. All he knew was that three men had just spotted them, and they were already walking closer. If you want to know exactly how far Mason would go to protect a total stranger, stay until the end. Chicago was cold that Thursday evening, with a light rain that never quite committed to falling. Mason Reed had just finished a long day at the industrial technology firm where he worked as lead safety and reliability engineer. Instead of heading straight home, he stopped at a small cafe near the train station to wait for a call from the sitter confirming that his daughter had made it home safely after her music lesson. That single detail was enough to establish who Mason was. After that, his daughter would stay far from the center of what came next, tucked safely away in a quiet corner of his life that none of this would ever reach. The cafe was the kind of place he liked precisely because nothing ever happened there. Tired commuters, students with laptops, regulars who nodded without needing conversation. It suited a man who spent his working hours thinking about how systems failed and who preferred his evenings uneventful. Mason sat alone at a two-person table near the window, watching the street through fogged glass, when a blonde woman walked in from the rain. Her name was Charlotte Hayes, though he did not know that yet. She wore a dark coat over a tailored business suit and carried a small leather bag pressed close to her side. On the surface, she looked entirely composed, but Mason noticed something that did not fit. She kept glancing at her own reflection in the window glass, not to check her appearance. She was watching what moved behind her. Charlotte walked past Mason's table, heading toward the back of the cafe, then stopped cold when the front door opened again. Three men in dark suits stepped inside: Jackson Cole, Connor Blake, Jason Ward. Charlotte turned back immediately. She did not ask who Mason was. She did not explain herself. She pulled out the empty chair across from him and sat down without waiting for permission. Then she said, so quietly he almost missed it, "Please pretend you know me." Mason had only a few seconds to decide. He could have stood up. He could have called the server over. He could have told her to find somewhere else to hide. Instead, he set his phone face down on the table. Charlotte leaned in closer and threaded her arm through his, the way a woman might lean into someone she had known for years. The three men saw the gesture and changed direction. They walked straight toward the table. Jackson stopped beside Charlotte first, his smile pleasant and entirely without warmth. He said her name, Charlotte. Mason understood something in that instant. This woman was not hiding from strangers on the street. She knew these men. Charlotte's grip on his arm tightened slightly. Jackson glanced at Mason and asked if he was her friend. Charlotte answered before Mason could open his mouth. "Yes," she said. Mason caught the signal and played along, turning to Charlotte as though they had been together for months. "I thought you said they weren't coming tonight," he said. The line landed harder than he expected. All three men went still, because now they had no idea how much Charlotte had already told this stranger. In trying to protect herself for a handful of seconds, Charlotte had accidentally turned Mason from a bystander into something far more dangerous to the three men standing over their table. A variable they had not planned for. None of them moved right away. Jackson kept smiling, but his eyes had already shifted to calculation, running through what a stranger might know and what a stranger might repeat. Connor's gaze drifted toward the exits, quiet and habitual, the way a man checks doors out of training rather than need. Jason simply looked uncomfortable, as though he had walked into a version of the plan nobody had described to him. Mason kept his face relaxed and his hand loosely wrapped around his coffee cup, giving nothing away, while beneath the table Charlotte's fingers stayed locked around his sleeve, like it was the only steady thing left in the room. Jackson kept his tone polite, the kind of politeness that felt rehearsed. He told Mason this was a private company matter and nothing that needed his attention. Mason answered that if Charlotte wanted to leave with them, she was welcome to say so herself. Charlotte said nothing. Connor stepped closer, and that was the moment Mason noticed the three men were not entirely aligned with one another. Jason looked tense, shifting his weight like he wanted to be anywhere else. Connor's attention kept sliding toward the exits, tracking every path out of the room. Jackson was the only one steering the conversation, and he steered it like a man used to being obeyed. Mason did not try to play the hero. He simply kept the exchange in a public space under bright light, in full view of the security camera mounted above the counter. It was a habit from his work, the instinct to look for the safest configuration in a room without anyone noticing he was doing it. Charlotte understood exactly what he was doing. She could see it in the way he angled his shoulders, the way he never let his voice rise, the way he made three armed intentions feel small simply by refusing to react to them. It was, she would later admit, the first calm thing she had witnessed in over a week. Jackson said, "You have no idea who she is." Mason answered, "Maybe not. But she just told me she doesn't want to leave with you." There was no legal ground for forcing Charlotte to go anywhere, and both men on either side of that table knew it. Jackson had to back off. Before turning away, he studied Mason for a long moment, the kind of look that memorized a face rather than simply seeing one. The three men walked out. Connor paused at the glass door for a few seconds longer than the others, looking straight at Charlotte through the window. Then he followed the rest outside. Charlotte released Mason's arm. She apologized immediately, the words tumbling out before he could respond. Mason asked only one question: "Will they come back?" Charlotte did not answer. Her phone buzzed on the table between them. A message lit the screen: "You made this worse." Mason watched something shift behind her eyes, the calm cracking just slightly at the edges. He asked if she needed to call the police. Charlotte said she couldn't, not yet. That answer told Mason this was not a simple case of harassment. Something larger was moving underneath it. Charlotte finally gave him her full name. Mason recognized it instantly. Hayes Meridian Technologies was the multi-billion-dollar firm the Chicago business press had been covering for weeks because of a massive pending merger. "Are you that Charlotte Hayes?" he asked. She nodded, then immediately added that it didn't matter. It mattered enormously. Charlotte explained that she had just walked out of a closed-door meeting at the hotel across the street, after discovering financial records that did not add up. Jackson wanted her to come back inside. She had refused. Mason asked why the chief executive of a major corporation would need to hide from her own chief financial officer, her own attorney, and her own head of security. Charlotte's answer was quiet: "Because I don't know anymore who actually works for me." She stood to leave alone, gathering her bag with the brisk efficiency of someone used to walking out of rooms on her own terms, even when the terms had clearly stopped being hers. Mason glanced through the window. A black sport utility vehicle idled across the street, engine running, headlights off, positioned at an angle that gave a clear view of the cafe entrance. It had not been there 20 minutes earlier. He said, "Maybe you shouldn't go out the front." Charlotte followed his gaze and went still. Whatever argument she had been preparing about not wanting to inconvenience a stranger any further seemed to leave her all at once. For the first time since sitting down at his table, she looked less like a woman managing a crisis and more like someone who had just realized how much bigger the crisis actually was. Mason led Charlotte out through the side door the manager used for deliveries, after a quiet word and a folded bill left on the counter. They walked several blocks instead of taking a car. Along the way, Charlotte began to talk. 2 weeks earlier, she had discovered that a vendor called North Star Industrial Holdings had been awarded contracts worth nearly $90 million. On paper, everything looked legitimate, but North Star barely employed anyone. It had no real manufacturing facility. It had no production history that matched the scale of what it claimed to deliver. Charlotte had requested an internal audit. Jackson delayed it. Jason found legal reasons to slow it further. Connor began controlling her schedule far more tightly than usual, inserting himself into meetings that had nothing to do with security. That evening she had met privately with an outside auditor she trusted. He had handed her a small storage drive containing copies of the underlying transactions. Less than an hour later, all three men had shown up at the cafe. Charlotte believed they already knew what she was carrying. Mason asked where the drive was now. Charlotte looked at him for a moment, then opened the clasp on the back of her smartwatch. A tiny drive was hidden inside the strap itself, no larger than a fingernail. Mason almost laughed at how carefully she had planned for exactly this kind of night. "That's why I'm still chief executive," she said. Mason did not take her home. He had no intention of pulling danger anywhere near his daughter's life. Instead, he brought her to the office of Ryan Foster, an independent attorney he had worked with years earlier during a technical dispute at his firm. Ryan agreed to help review the files. While they waited for him to arrive, Charlotte asked why a complete stranger would risk anything to help her. Mason said he wasn't sure he was helping. "Maybe I just don't like watching three men try to put a woman in a car she doesn't want to get into." Charlotte laughed for the first time that night. It lasted only a moment, brief and unpracticed, nothing close to romance yet, just relief finding a small crack to escape through. Ryan opened the drive on a secured laptop, running the files through a checksum before he would even let the folder open, the habit of a man who had watched evidence get quietly poisoned before. The files showed dozens of payments flowing to Northstar across nearly a year, each invoice slightly different in formatting, as though written by several hands trying to imitate one voice. But the final trail led to another holding company layered behind it, registered through an address that turned out to be a mail drop above a dry cleaner on the north side of the city. Ryan sat back from the screen for a moment, rubbing his eyes. In 20 years of contract law, he said, this was one of the cleaner shell structures he had seen, which was not a compliment. Before Ryan could dig further, he found something worse. An internal message. Sender, Connor Blake. The message referenced the need to keep Charlotte contained before Monday's vote. Charlotte went very still. On Monday, the board was scheduled to vote on the largest merger in the company's history. If she opposed it publicly with unfinished proof, the vote could collapse and take her credibility down with it. Ryan gave them the harder truth. This wasn't simple embezzlement. Someone appeared to be working to remove Charlotte from operational control before that vote ever happened. Just then, Mason's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, a photograph. Mason and Charlotte, walking out of the cafe together, caught from across the street at the exact angle of the black vehicle he had noticed earlier. Beneath it, 5 words. You should have walked away. Mason set the phone down on Ryan's desk and turned it so Charlotte could see. He did not raise his voice, and he did not reach for his coat to leave, though some part of him understood that either reaction would have made sense. Instead, he asked a simple, practical question. Who else has access to whatever system pulled that picture together, and how fast can we find out? Charlotte looked at him for a long moment before answering, as though recalculating something about him entirely. Mason understood immediately that the situation had changed. He was no longer an accidental witness. He had been identified. Charlotte wanted him to step back entirely. She offered to cover a hotel, private protection, whatever it took to keep him and his family untouched by any of it. Mason turned down the money. He agreed only to stay away from his own apartment for a few days, unwilling to risk anyone showing up near his daughter. His daughter went to stay with family for the time being. There were no scenes of a child facing danger. That part of his life stayed sealed off exactly where he wanted it. Charlotte felt the weight of that decision settle on her. It was the first time she truly understood the price a total stranger was paying, simply because he had chosen to help her. Ryan kept working through the files. An important detail surfaced. Jackson was not simply skimming money for himself. Northstar was, in reality, controlled through several layers of shell entities by a group of outside investors quietly preparing to acquire a large block of Hayes Meridian stock. If Monday's merger vote passed, that structure would leave the company carrying hundreds of millions in hidden financial obligations, weakening it just enough for the same group to seize effective control piece by piece over the following year. Charlotte was the only real obstacle standing in front of it. Every signature required for the merger to close ran through her office. Every safeguard the company had built over the years assumed a chief executive who could not be quietly maneuvered out of her own decisions. Remove that assumption, and the entire plan became almost frictionless. It was, Ryan admitted, a patient design. Whoever built it had clearly studied the company's governance structure for a long time before ever touching a single contract. Jackson's plan, as Ryan pieced it together, was to convince the board that Charlotte had become erratic and unreliable in her decision-making. Her disappearance from tonight's meeting would be framed as evidence of exactly that. Charlotte saw the shape of the trap closing around her. If she went into hiding, Jackson would win by default. If she walked back into the company without enough proof to stop him, Jackson would still win simply through the calendar itself. Mason said, "Then you need a third option." "What's that?" Charlotte asked. "Let them believe you still don't know enough." They decided not to reveal the drive yet. Charlotte would return to the office the next morning as though nothing unusual had happened. Mason would not appear beside her as any kind of protector. He would only help analyze the technical records connected to Northstar, quietly, from Ryan's office. This was where his actual profession became useful in a way none of them had expected. He found that Northstar had claimed to deliver industrial equipment carrying serial numbers that could not possibly exist, because that numbering format belonged to a product line discontinued 6 years earlier. The accounting evidence now had a technical anchor pinning it firmly in place, something no lawyer could argue away as a clerical error. Late that night, Charlotte and Mason sat together in Ryan's office long after Ryan himself had gone to make coffee down the hall. Charlotte asked if he ever regretted letting her sit down at his table. About 5 times so far, Mason answered. Charlotte looked at him, unsure whether to smile or brace herself. Mason added, but not enough to tell you to leave. A small current of something warmer passed between them. No kiss, no declaration. Just the first moment Charlotte allowed herself to trust someone who clearly wanted nothing from her title, her company, or her name. She realized, watching him work through spreadsheets with the same quiet focus he probably brought to keeping industrial systems from failing, that she had spent years surrounded by people chasing her position, and almost none chasing anything simpler than that. Outside, the city had gone fully dark, the rain from earlier finally settling into a thin, steady drizzle against the office windows. Neither of them mentioned the hour. There was too much left to verify, and somewhere across town, 3 men were almost certainly doing the same thing, deciding how much damage one stranger with a laptop could realistically do to a plan they had spent months building. Friday morning arrived gray and unremarkable. Charlotte walked into Hayes' Meridian headquarters as though nothing had happened the night before. Jackson was clearly startled, though he covered it fast, offering a warm greeting that did not quite reach his eyes. Connor tried to review her schedule the moment she stepped off the elevator. Charlotte told him coolly that she did not need an escort today. Jason appeared minutes later with a document asking her to confirm, in writing, that she had left last night's meeting due to stress. Charlotte read it carefully. She did not sign it. Instead, she began playing their own game back at them, giving away nothing while appearing to give away everything, answering every question with just enough uncertainty to keep them guessing without ever technically lying. By mid-morning, she had sat through 2 separate meetings designed, she suspected, to gauge her state of mind. She smiled through both of them, took careful notes, and gave nobody a single reason to believe she knew anything more than she had the day before. Meanwhile, Mason and Ryan kept working through the technical evidence. Mason found that 3 separate Northstar shipments were logged as having arrived at a testing facility in Wisconsin. Under the pretense of a routine technical verification call, he contacted the facility directly. No shipment matching those records had ever arrived there. The facility manager, mildly confused by the question, confirmed they had never even worked with a supplier by that name. It was another piece of direct, undeniable proof, the kind that did not rely on interpretation or accounting judgment, only on a fact that either happened or did not. But the situation shifted without warning. Ryan's system flagged an alert. Several of the encrypted files on the drive carried a hidden mechanism that pinged an external server the moment they were opened. Their location may have just been exposed. Within minutes, Ryan moved everything onto a secured external archive, severing the local copies from anything traceable back to his office address. Charlotte, still at headquarters, had no idea any of this was happening. Mason called her. No answer. He tried again. Still nothing. On the 3rd attempt, Connor picked up instead. "Miss Hayes' phone is currently with our security team," he said, his voice smooth and unbothered. Mason understood immediately that something was wrong. Connor added, "You should probably get back to your own life, Mason." The call ended before Mason could respond. He did not rush toward the building the way people did in movies. He did something steadier. He called Ryan. He called Evelyn Grant, the chair of the board, through a professional contact who could vouch for him, and sent her a portion of the evidence they had already secured. At headquarters, Jackson had called an emergency session, arguing that Charlotte was showing signs of instability that the board needed to address immediately. Charlotte walked into the conference room to find 5 board members already seated. Jackson began describing how the chief executive had walked out of an official meeting, evaded her own security detail, and vanished for hours with an unidentified man. A photograph of Mason and Charlotte outside the cafe appeared on the screen behind him. Charlotte understood at once. Mason had become a tool for undermining her credibility in front of the one room that could remove her from power. Jackson asked, with a thin edge of amusement, whether she cared to tell the board exactly who this man was. Charlotte studied the photograph for a long moment. Then she said yes. The conference room door opened. Mason walked in beside Ryan and Evelyn. Charlotte said, "This is the man who discovered that your vendor doesn't actually exist." Jackson's smile did not fully leave his face, but something behind it flickered, a recalibration happening in real time as he tried to understand how much ground he had already lost. Around the table, the other board members shifted in their seats, sensing that the meeting they had walked into was no longer the meeting they had been told to expect. Evelyn Grant folded her hands on the table and said nothing yet, watching the room the way she watched every negotiation, waiting to see who would speak first out of nerves rather than confidence. Evelyn ordered the conference room doors locked and instructed that nothing be deleted from any company system for the remainder of the day. Ryan presented the evidence in layers, methodically, without drama. First the payments, then the shell company behind them, then the falsified equipment serial numbers, then confirmation that no shipment had ever reached its stated destination. Finally, the internal message from Connor. Jackson denied everything. He suggested Charlotte had conspired with Mason to fabricate the entire record. Mason calmly asked the technology team to compare file creation timestamps against the original company servers, a request simple enough that refusing it would have looked far worse than complying. Charlotte said very little. She let the evidence carry its own weight, the way she had learned long ago that over-explaining a truth often made it sound less like one. Jason began to lose his composure. His hands, folded tightly on the table, had gone pale at the knuckles, and he kept glancing at Jackson as though waiting for permission to speak that never came. Evelyn noticed immediately. She had chaired enough tense meetings over the years to recognize the exact posture of a man deciding whether loyalty was still worth the risk. She asked him directly, "When did you first learn that Northstar wasn't real?" Jason did not answer. Jackson glanced at him. Just a look, but Mason saw it clearly. It was the same controlling glance he had noticed the previous night back at the cafe when Jackson had first walked through the door. Jason finally broke the silence. He admitted that Jackson had designed the legal structure behind the shell company. Connor had been responsible for tracking Charlotte's movements. Jason himself had been asked to prepare documents that would let the board suspend her authority as chief executive on Monday morning, before the vote could take place with her still in control of it. Charlotte asked the obvious question. "Then why did the three of you come looking for me last night?" Jason answered, "Because Jackson believed you already had a copy." This was the moment the title of the whole ordeal finally made sense out loud. The three men had not walked through that cafe door to force Charlotte into a car. They had walked in to recover the drive before she could hand it to anyone outside the company. Every strange detail from the night before finally lined up. The urgency in Jackson's voice. The way Connor had scanned the room instead of simply greeting her. The message that had arrived within minutes of them leaving, warning that she had made things worse. None of it had been about her safety. All of it had been about containment. Connor tried to deny his part, but security logs, vehicle records, and internal messages together made a case that no amount of denial could soften. He had used the company's own security infrastructure to track his chief executive without authorization, treating her like a threat rather than the person he answered to. Evelyn suspended Jackson and Connor on the spot. An independent investigation was opened before the meeting even ended. Regulators were notified about the signs of financial fraud uncovered in the files. Jason agreed to cooperate fully in exchange for leniency. Jackson was escorted out by outside security, his composure finally cracking somewhere between the conference table and the elevator. Before he left, he turned back toward Mason. "All of this happened because you couldn't mind your own business," he said. Mason answered evenly. "No, it happened because she sat down at the right table." Charlotte looked at Mason. For the first time since the night before, she genuinely smiled, and it reached all the way to her eyes. Around them, the room had already shifted into a different kind of motion, board members quietly conferring, Evelyn issuing instructions to legal and to the technology team, the machinery of a large company beginning the slow work of correcting itself. For a moment, none of it touched the two of them at all. Weeks passed. The investigation confirmed a long list of falsified transactions. Jackson faced formal charges connected to corporate fraud and breach of financial duty. Connor was terminated and placed under investigation for misusing company security systems. Jason cooperated fully in exchange for reduced liability. The merger vote was suspended indefinitely. Charlotte remained chief executive, but the victory did not feel the way everyone around her assumed it would. The whole ordeal forced her to confront an assumption she had built her entire adult life around, that power would eventually make her safe. In practice, power had only made it harder to know who around her could actually be trusted. For years, she had measured loyalty by proximity, assuming that the people closest to her office door were also the people closest to her interests. The last month had rewritten that math entirely. She spent several evenings alone in her apartment, going through old calendars and meeting notes, trying to trace the exact point where trust had started narrowing without her noticing. She never quite found it. Perhaps there had been no single moment, only a slow accumulation of small compromises, the kind that never look dangerous until they are examined altogether. Evelyn had quietly reorganized the board's oversight committees within days. adding independent voices who owed nothing to Jackson's old network. It helped, but it did not undo the discomfort of realizing how close the company had come to losing its footing entirely. Charlotte wanted to thank Mason properly, offering him a significant sum of money. He turned it down. She offered him a senior position at Hayes Meridian. He turned that down too. He explained without much drama that he liked the work he already did and the life he had already built around his daughter, and that neither one needed rearranging on account of a night he still mostly thought of as an accident of timing. Charlotte listened to all of it and did not entirely believe the part about it being an accident, though she let it go for the moment. She finally asked, somewhat irritated, if he intended to refuse everything she tried to give him. Mason said, "Not everything." "What do you want then?" she asked. He thought about it. "Dinner," he said. Charlotte looked surprised. Mason explained, "No chief financial officer. No attorneys. No 3 men walking through a door." Charlotte laughed. "Is this a date?" she asked. Mason answered, "I believe you're the chief executive. I'll let you classify it." The romance moved up a notch, though still gently, still without pressure. That evening they returned to the same cafe where it had all begun. The rain had stopped completely this time, and the window that had once fogged with condensation now let in a clear view of the street outside, quiet and unremarkable in exactly the way Mason had always liked it. The same table. Charlotte sat down across from him, in the same seat she had taken that first night, though this time she did not glance at her own reflection once. She looked around the room. "Strange, being back here." "What's strange?" Mason asked. "The first time I sat down, all I wanted was for you to pretend you knew me." Mason studied her for a moment. "And now?" he asked. Charlotte didn't answer right away, taking her time with it as though the sentence deserved more care than a quick reply. "Now I want you to actually know me." Mason reached across the table, not for her hand yet, just to move the small candle between them slightly to one side, giving her an unobstructed view of him. It was a small gesture, but it felt deliberate. The kind of thing a careful man did when he meant to be seen clearly for once instead of half hidden behind a role he was playing. The relationship developed slowly over the following months. Charlotte did not immediately become part of Mason's household. Mason did not turn into some kind of corporate figure simply because he now knew a chief executive. The two of them kept their lives mostly separate, and that separation was exactly what made the whole thing feel believable rather than rushed. They met for dinners that had nothing to do with company business, took slow walks along the river on weekends when neither of them had anywhere else to be, and gave each other plenty of room to return, when needed, to the ordinary rhythms of work and family that had defined their lives long before that rainy Thursday. Charlotte gradually learned how to exist outside of boardrooms, discovering that silence in a restaurant did not have to mean tension, and that not every question required a calculated answer. Mason gradually understood that behind the composed, distant image of a chief executive was a woman who had spent years learning to doubt nearly everyone around her. His daughter appeared only briefly, much later, once the relationship between the two adults had settled into something steady. She was never used as a bridge to pull them closer together. She was never the reason they decided to stay. The center of the story remained two adults choosing each other deliberately and without any outside pressure to do so. Charlotte also changed how Hayes Meridian operated. She created an independent audit function, separated the security division from any authority over financial matters, and added new independent voices to the board, determined that no single person would ever again hold enough unchecked influence to move against her or against anyone else in the company, without a dozen other eyes noticing first. The changes were unglamorous, mostly procedural, the kind of reform that never made headlines. But Charlotte found she cared far more about that quiet, structural safety than she ever had about the size of any single deal. Mason eventually agreed to work as an outside technical advisor for the company, on the condition that he never reported directly to Charlotte. Charlotte teased him about it. "Afraid I'll play favorites?" she asked. Mason answered, "Afraid you'll schedule meetings at 7 in the morning." A year after that first night, they sat once more at the same cafe. Mason set 2 cups of coffee down on the table between them. Charlotte asked, "Do you know what I was thinking exactly 1 year ago tonight? That I looked trustworthy?" "No." Charlotte smiled. "I was thinking you looked like the least dangerous person in the room." Mason laughed. "That's romantic." Charlotte reached across the table. "Then I found out I was wrong about that." Mason took her hand. There was no grand declaration, no proposal. Just two people who understood, quietly and without needing to say it out loud, that whatever had started as a performance had long since stopped being one. Outside the window, the street looked exactly as it had that first rainy evening, ordinary and unremarkable, full of people hurrying past who had no idea what had once unfolded at this particular table. Neither of them needed anyone else to know. It was enough that they did. A year and a half later, Charlotte and Mason attended a small charity gathering in Chicago. Nothing corporate about it. No press, no board members, just a room full of quiet conversation, string lights, and people who had nothing to do with mergers or vendors or boardroom votes. Charlotte arrived first. Mason was across the room talking with a small group near the far wall, laughing easily at something one of them had said, entirely at ease in a way that still occasionally surprised her. A friend of Charlotte's glanced over at him and asked who he was. Charlotte looked at Mason for a long moment. The question pulled her straight back to that rainy night at the cafe, the table by the window. Her hand trembling beneath it, 3 men walking through the door, and a total stranger who decided without hesitation that her whispered request deserved to be honored. Charlotte answered, "Mason Reed." Her friend laughed. "I mean, what is he to you?" Before Charlotte could answer, Mason crossed the room and joined them, catching only the tail end of the question. He looked at Charlotte, a familiar spark of amusement in his eyes. "Do you need me to pretend I know you?" he asked. Charlotte laughed and shook her head. Not this time. She slipped her arm through his, the same gesture from that very first night. But her hand did not shake this time. Nobody was chasing her. There was no hidden drive, no conspiracy waiting to unravel, no role left to maintain. "You actually know me now," she said. Mason answered, "I do." He looked at her, something quietly serious behind the warmth in his expression. That's the dangerous part. Charlotte laughed and pulled him further into the room. The door closed behind them. This time, no men in dark suits followed them through it. And the woman who had once needed a stranger to pretend he knew her had finally found someone who actually wanted to stay. No performance required, no audience left to convince, only the two of them walking out into the ordinary evening together, exactly as they were.